We come to the seventh presentation in this 2014 series, which has the overall title Parayana, and its subtitle is Refreshing the Way. And this famous photograph of our planet rising like the moon above Luna. And we put a rainbow infinity sign, which is the central symbol of my work for a long, long time. And we have seen how the Parayana had, by the 21st century, begun to accumulate a tremendous amount of energy and dynamic, especially in terms of time. That in the universe, time is an energy, and that the energy of time is spontaneously emerged, fertile zero field, an emptiness that also is fullness. The Greek word for that is pleroma. And that the spontaneous emergence of time as a first dimension blossoms instantly because there is now time. It can happen instantly into the dimensions of space. And once space-time has brought itself into phenomenality, the integral nature of that comes together. And all of this has the characteristic that there is in nature a quality of, and that the ultimate reality of emergence is literally of birth, and that Mother Nature is the feminine origin of the universe. So that whenever there is going to be a divinity present in the universe, it will be feminine. One of the really interesting historians of the medieval period is Caroline Bynum Walker. And in 1981, the Center for Medieval Studies at UCLA published her series of essays collected together under the title Jesus as Mother, which is not just a confabulation of the Virgin Mother and then Jesus as the only begotten Son, but it is poignant because the first time that Jesus as Mother was visioned was by Anselm of Canterbury. And this is the Oxford World's Classic major selection of Anselm's works. Anselm lived from the late 900s into, or the early 1000s, 1033, and he lived into the beginnings of the 12th century, 1105. So that you have this quality that around the 1100 mark in Western history, keeping track of, a feminine vision of divinity rose with such power that even someone like a lifetime monk, Anselm was born in Aosta, Italy, and then migrated to what was then going to be France, and he ended up for some while at Bec, which is a was a small city in the province of Normandy. And then in visiting England, he was selected as the Archbishop of Canterbury and got into many scrapes with authorities, and over a period of about 20 years was constantly going back in exile because it was uncomfortable and impossible to stay as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And it is Anselm of Bec that is the beginnings of a sense that there is something stirring in what became France, in northern Gaul, about 1100. And Normandy itself is characterized by the fact that it is the site at the time of the building of Chartres Cathedral. And Chartres Cathedral is dedicated to Our Lady, the Virgin Mother Mary. And it is about that time that literally a cult of the Virgin Mary becomes centered in that northern part of France around 1100, and it is exactly at 1100 that one of the most outstanding and famous women of all time is born. Her name was Heloise. And Heloise is famous forever because her letters with Peter Abelard has been a best-selling book since they were put together over 800 years ago. This is the latest edition in Penguin Classics, which takes the 1974 translation by Betty Radis and improves it and adds other things. Many other letters of Abelard and Heloise came together. And in particular, Abelard was one of the most famous philosophers, philosophy teachers. He was one of the greatest intellectual monks of the age. Sort of one speaks in medieval history, philosophic history, that Abelard is the inheritor of Anselm, that he becomes the major voice. But like Anselm, he encumbered himself because of some of the ideas that he had, and some of his ideas went back to the age of Charlemagne. That was about 200 years before. And the reason why this is important is that we're talking about something that has been characterized as the Dark Ages for a very long time. That even before the fall of Rome, there was a collapse of civilization, and a progressive collapse, such that it was characterized at one time in the reign of Justinian, that he closed the school of Plato in Athens because there were no more students. In fact, there were no more students, there were no more teachers. And after 1,000 years, it was abandoned. It was closed. And so the Dark Ages, which are like the Middle Ages, the medieval period now, medieval because it is in between a classic firmness and a Renaissance rediscovery and rebirth in civilization of that classic greatness. What's interesting in these time forms is that the feminine becomes the focus in a divine wisdom way of how that Renaissance had a prelude in the 1100s, in the 12th century, and since the early 20th century, it's been common parlance and studies of history, of philosophy, to speak of the 12th century Renaissance, that in the 1100s there was the sudden blossoming early in the 1100s that was like an explosion that heralded as a distant prelude to the Renaissance in Italy, especially founding itself in Florence, the Florentine Renaissance, including also Venice and Rome and Milano and so forth, but centered there. And one of the great rediscoveries in the Renaissance is that the ancient twin to Rome, Byzantium, had finally fallen to Islamic troops under Muhammad the Conqueror in 1453, and the last remaining savants of the Byzantine Empire fled with precious books under their robes and made their way to Venice. And there in Venice, they were trying to survive by not only hawking these books, but offering to be employed to help translate them into Latin so that they could then be translated into other languages and read in the West. And one of the great royal geniuses, not royal just, but noble. There's a difference between royalty and nobility. Royalty is always after power and money and property. And the tradition is to hold on to those and increase those. Whereas nobility is to understand through vision and through its development of the arts and the sciences some dimension of the historical developments that have led, including where it is going into the future, so that the nobles are always concerned with persons who have a dimension of vision, capable of appreciating the arts, participating in the bringing of history into a better and better understanding through the refinement of vision, the refinement of art, so that the history then becomes a living continuity and one can move into the future with that accumulated possibility. And out of that, the universe slides into a great transform and becomes a cosmos. So that the dimensions of consciousness are the way in which civilization teases out possibilities from the culture, which was largely always an oral tradition, a tradition of experience that was passed on in terms of exemplars through myths, through the mythic horizon of being able to recount and understand, and that based upon the rituals and the ritual objects, the phenomena and the actions that one does, and then all of that body, speech, comes together, integrates as the mind, and that body, speech, and mind then are this grand triad, this triangle of stability that owes itself only its origins to nature. And indeed, that inclusion of nature in body, speech, and mind is the frame of reference that the universe honors in terms of its birthing, its emergence into the ritual basis, to the mythic development of experience through oral language, and then the integration, because the oral language becomes written, and the written language makes the structure of symbolic thought. And that this frame of reference then has something mysterious in the feminine, in nature, but is more and more excluded when one comes to the body, and then speech, and then mind. And that frame of reference as a square of attention becomes something that is not seen as giving comfort, but seen as making an entrapment. It is seen as an entrapment because there is, in this four-square essentiality of the way in which we understand and live and do and will understand and will do, and that this is then the stability of what is identifiably real to us. But a fifth essence, a quintessence comes into play whenever there is visioning. And that visioning then has to be, if not curtailed, it has to be rechanneled. And one of the great exemplars of rechanneling that happens in regressive qualities that creep into civilization happened in particular to shine again in the late 1000s, the early 1100s in northern France. And that resurgence of the power of that curtailment was the ability then to have someone come into play who was masterful at being able to make a frame of reference that not only made sense, but made sense in the way that one would then understand that anything outside of it was really beginning to be ridiculous, was really beginning to sabotage the stability, was beginning to have an untoward effect on life, security, property, the happiness that comes with assured hierarchies, and so forth. And one of the manifestations of that in the late 1000s, going into the early 1100s, was the development of a nascent school for Jewish studies. The school had been founded by Charlemagne in the late 800s, and he had brought in rabbinical scholars to his empire, and at the city of Mayence, he installed a Talmudic school. And that Talmudic school eventually came into the purview of a very famous rabbi at that time. His name is quite interesting. He is said to be a son of this whole tradition. And when one looks at a publication of the Jewish Publication Society of America in Philadelphia, the figure that comes into play here is the subject of the book is Rashi, and Rashi is able to take the Talmudic studies that had been brought together and codified at this Talmudic school in Mayence, and was able then to master the way in which the Talmud was seen as being extremely powerful, more powerful even than the Bible. And one runs across in the late 20th century, early 21st century, scholarly compendia like this, the Talmud selected writings published in the Classics of Western Spirituality, published by the Paulus Press, a supposedly ecumenical Catholic society project. And included in this is the quality that the Talmud, which is a huge development, it took about 500 years of development. It began in 90 CE, the Common Era, 90 AD, in a part of Palestine called Jamnia, a city, in 90 CE, and by the time of about 500 CE, the Talmud that had been received largely from scholars centered in ancient Babylon, the Babylonian exile period of Ezekiel and so forth, and that this Babylonian Talmud, translated into English, runs to about 10 volumes, huge, many thousands of pages. It was Rashi who finally brought together, and this is one of the conclusions. The collective of the sages, the early rabbis were called sages, the age of the sages. The collective of the sages and no one else now determine the meaning of Torah. The Torah is no longer in heaven, that's in quotation marks. Even its heavenly giver, capitalized, can no longer interfere in the process of interpreting it, applying it, and expanding its scope. So that intellectual, commentarial accrual is like a layered surface that increasingly complexifies, and it encases what before had been problematic. And they go on to point out, and indeed in the early 1100s it was pointed out, that the Bible is the work of many different qualities. It isn't just a Moses who writes the Pentateuch, the Torah, but there are books by prophets, there are books by famous people, by historians, and all of this makes a way in which there is a tremendous variety in the Bible that does not fit into a frame of reference, does not comfortably settle into a square of attention. In fact, tends to more and more have the dynamic to develop itself. And one of the flaws, as one group sees it, is that the feminine visioning becomes sometimes quintessentially extraordinarily powerful. And it's in the early 1100s that one finds, for the first time in many hundreds of years, almost 600 years, you begin to find a refinement of teachable, learnable, feminine genius. The last woman to have that kind of scope and depth was Hypatia, who in the early 400s was a teacher. Her father, Theron, was the greatest mathematician of his age, taught Platonic mathematics, and she inherited that genius and teaching ability. She was seized by her students, who were supposed to be celibate monks, and they murdered her in the most brutal way. She was stabbed with their styluses, and then the flesh was stripped from the bones. And this was a sign, this was a warning. Women are not to have the ability to teach men about religion, about divinity, about the philosophic refinement of things. And the first time that one finds a return of the feminine genius on that level of Hypatia is in the early 1100s in what was northern France and actually a little bit of southern Germany. And one of the earliest figures in that was Hildegard of Bingen, which we will take a look at a future presentation. But the most outstanding figure was Heloise. And it is Heloise who was born exactly in 1100 and who lived to 1164. And when she was 17, her intellectual prowess allowed her to be put into a tutorage with Peter Abelard, the genius of his day. And she shone. She was so brilliant, not only as an intellectual genius and giant, but her ability to, as even a late teenage feminine, to be able to modulate this with a vivacity that of life and of temperament that Abelard fell in love with her, and in fact began an affair with her. And in fact, a son was born out of that affair, and his name was given to him was Astrolabe, a way of keeping, an instrument for keeping track of the movements of the heavens and their meaningfulness on earth. And as soon as Astrolabe was born, the uncle of Heloise realized that this was a terrible state of affairs, that his niece should be having an affair with not just a monk, but with one of the most outstanding teaching, intellectual genius monks of the age. And he forced them to get married. And marriage was a condition that obviated many of the privileges of monasticism. If you were married, you could not do many things. One of the outstanding things that came out of this is that if you were married, you could not go on crusades. And one of the very powerful leaders of northern France, in between Normandy and some of the other provinces like Burgundy and so forth, one of the wealthiest provinces was Champagne, from where we get the word and the product champagne. And in Champagne, the Count of Champagne, whose name was Hugh of Champagne, was constructive to want to go into the Crusades with all of the blessing of powerful intellectual monk geniuses. And one of the geniuses that he supported was Bernard of Clairvaux. And it was Hugh of Champagne that donated the lands and made the economic investment, and so that Bernard of Clairvaux with the Carthusians became a very powerful place of residence and learning and study. And he became an arch critic of Abelard, because Abelard, meantime, decided to put Heloise into a convent, into a nunnery. He was at the time, and they were at the time, in Paris, medieval Paris. In fact, one of the genius intellects that made the University of Paris at the time absolutely one of the best places in the world to study. The University of Paris and Oxford University were the two great new university centers in that 12th century Renaissance. When the uncle of Heloise found out that she had been put into a convent, thus having taken those vows as a nun, it nullified the marriage. It bastardized the son. It demonized for the uncle Abelard. And so he sent a group of men to accost him, to force him to the ground, and they castrated him. In the meantime, Heloise, now approaching the ripe old age of 20, in the convent at Argenteuil, which later on was a place that Monet, centuries later, would do a lot of his famous paintings and drawings, just north outside of Paris. Abelard began to plan better and better places for Heloise to develop her intellectual prowess, her dynamic personality, and eventually he located Heloise near the capital of Champagne. The city was called Troyes, Troyes in Francais, but Troyes is one of the great places in the world at that time. For one thing, it was where Rashi was born and where his center of Jewish Talmudic studies really took hold in a very big way. And it was the place in which he died. Troyes was on the major route that led eventually into northern France through Troyes, and one would go down through France and into Italy, and eventually it would have its origin in Milano, and it was called the Via Agrippa. Agrippa was the great architect, right-hand man of Augustus Caesar. And it was Augustus Caesar who made Troyes into a Roman city 2,000 years ago. And it was called after his name, Augusto Farnese, and he separated the two major tribal power structures and left one in charge of the city and made it the capital of Champagne, the place where then the Count of Champagne would have his count seat and the base of his power. And of course, because it was a crusade to go to the Holy Land, to take the Holy Land back from the Muslims on behalf of the Christians, one of the snags in the whole thing was the power of Jewish Talmudic studies under Rashi in Troyes that suddenly loomed as a real possibility of danger. In order to emphasize that there was a Christian Jerusalem that had obviated a Jewish Jerusalem. The whole order of the Knights Templar was founded in Troyes in 1119. So that you had, all of a sudden, a tremendous intellectual implosion, almost like setting off an atomic bomb in civilization, in a city that at the time had perhaps no more than 12 to 15,000 people. But it had become the pivotal center of the development of the whole meaning of the past into the possibilities, like an hourglass of the future of civilization, all in this one sudden place in a few generations, in order to counter the Knights Templar crusading faction from going to make Jerusalem a part of the new Christian Holy Land, and thus obviating the idea of a Jewish Jerusalem Holy Land permanently, and taking it back from the Islamic capital of the Holy Land. And all of this came to grate on Abelard, who then moved Heloise to a new monastic development, and it was named after the Gospel according to John. Towards the end of the Gospel according to John, when Jesus was saying, I must go, I must be betrayed and die, and this has to be, because unless I die, I cannot then be in a form by which I can send you the Paraclete. And the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit, will be your teacher from here on infinitely. And so Abelard made the monastic development there for Heloise, just north of Troyes, and it was called the Paraclete. The Beautiful Life of Abelard by M.T. Clancy has a frontispiece that has the tombstone of Heloise and Abelard, and in the great 2013 edition of the refined and enlarged, much enlarged letters of Heloise and Abelard, the frontispiece is all of the buildings of the Paraclete, Heloise's convent and nunnery just north of Troyes. And when we come back, we'll see that this convolution all around 1118, 1119, in this little area of Champagne, was to have repercussions for the development of civilization right up until our own time. Let's take a little break and we'll come back. Let's come back to an intensity with a recognition. Time forms in nature are all of the same flow. Time in the universe is time. Even though it is mischaracterized as the fourth dimension, it still is a dimension with space-time, and one can deal in the universe with space-time, like Einstein. But when consciousness comes into play, other dimensions, further dimensions, beyond dimensions, Parayana dimensions come in to play, and they play accumulatively more and more. one of the difficulties that came up about a generation ago. Alan Bluth talked about the accelerated universe, that somehow the computations of the energy from the Big Bang into the universe gave the result on very high-end esoteric mathematics that the universe accelerated about a third of the way through and began to expand faster, seemingly, more, seemingly. Because about 10 billion years ago, consciousness in the universe came into play in such a way that there were now more dimensions than space-time. And by our participation, it isn't just the here and now. It is whatever it will be all possible worlds. So we're beginning to be able to look at not only coloring outside of the outline forms, but to see that there is a curiosity that one of the mysterious, unsolvable, irresolvable pivots in the current human population on this world is that they are not able to resolve Jerusalem. The contention over Jerusalem is daily news, has been daily news for some long while, not just from the creation of the state of Israel in 1948, but before then, Jews were not allowed to visit the most holy site in Hebron, and that is what anciently was called the Cave of Machpelah, which over the centuries, the development is that the burial place of Abraham and Sarah is now in a very large, has been for a long time, a very large structure. Not only are the tombs of Abraham and Sarah there, but the tombs of Isaac and Rebekah are there. The tomb of Jacob, that this holiest place of the patriarchal inheritance was outlawed to Jews for a long time. The inability to resolve Jerusalem immediately can go back to all of the complications in the Mideast. Not just with the Christian history development of Europe and so forth, vis-a-vis the tussle with Islam and its heritages going back to the Crusades. And that the Jewish quotient, even then at the beginning of the Crusades, was small, but nevertheless a real issue. And not only that, but the developments of what became Christianity have obviated the origins of the way of Jesus, which included the feminine. Not so much Jesus' mother, but Jesus and Mary Magdalene as shared presence, as a tunable pair become not one, but as many as infinity needs be. World without end. And the core of this is in the Gospel according to John. And the whole latter emphasis of the Gospel according to John is that the Paraclete will be sent to mankind because of the transform of Jesus, the figure, into Jesus, the spiritual openness, the openness of the way through the interface with the feminine, not his mother, but with Mary Magdalene. And that tunability has worlds without end, no limits whatsoever. And that it brings the history of the Bible into an interpenetrative play so that the New Testament is not so much a New Testament. That's the kind of development that the formal, sociologically approved, power structure, moneyed, royal quality is encapsulated all in the military order of the Knights of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, the Knights Templar. At the very same time that the Knights Templar is being founded in Troyes, one of the founders, a very close friend of Hugh, Count of Champagne, was another Hugh de Payens. Payens was a village about 8 miles north of Troyes and very close to the Paraclete, Heloise's great monastic convent complex. And one has to understand that Hugh de Payens was one of the founders of the Knights Templar, one of the two original of the 9 knights as the 9. And one can understand that it has an echo. It has an echo, for instance, in Tolkien, in The Lord of the Rings. The 9 kings that have turned into wraiths, into the Nazgul, who are working to keep there being a new Middle Earth, like a new Middle Ages. All of this is Al-Quran and can be seen not only as a pivot, but that pivot has another aspect to that called a compass, and the pivot stops at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and then draws not just a circle, but a wider rippling of circles within circles within circles. And what's involved really is something extraordinary, because when one realizes it isn't Christianity as an entity, as a sociological empire, as a province of the Church of Rome, of all places. All of this becomes moot because when, as we have done in our work for almost half a century, more and more the unveiling of the way, the Parayana, in all of its complexities, it involves the transform of Buddhism from the Buddha to the Bodhisattvas. And that transform of the Mahayana from the old Theravada, the Theravada as the path of the elders, where The sisters are second class. They're really not to be admitted into the Sangha. They really can't appreciate the Dharma. They really don't participate with the Buddha. Well, yes, theoretically they must have Buddha nature, but they're sisters that are on the outside. And none of that is true. In the Mahayana, the beginnings of the Mahayana, the star visionary figure is the Lady Prajnaparamita, the Lady of the Perfection of Wisdom, a direct gift of Saint Thomas. And if one looks at the Gospel of St. Thomas, which resurfaced after being jettisoned and covered up and thrown away for how long? Almost 1,700 years, showed up with the Nag Hammadi material found in Egypt, along with the Gospel of Philip that had been thrown away and also lost for 1,700 years, because as soon as the formal sociological power structure of the church became imbued with an influx of power of the Roman Empire under Constantine, all of a sudden what was possible is the exclusion of anyone or anything that could upset this frame of reference, including, as we mentioned at the beginning of the first half, someone as beautifully talented and capable as Hypatia, murdered by her would-be monk students in the worst possible way, desecrated, thrown away. And it isn't until one comes to the 11th century, 1100s, the 12th century, that one finds the women of genius like Hildegard of Bingen, like Heloise, and then followed by several generations of incredible genius among the women. It's extraordinary to realize that Heloise was taught by the most brilliant mind of that 12th century Renaissance until he passed away. He died in 1142, and by that time Heloise, as the abbess of the whole complex of the Paraclete, was herself, like Hildegard of Bingen, tremendously expanding. And her understanding of marriage, her understanding of love, her understanding of being not just feminine, but being a woman of enormous talent. One would like to ask, and one does ask, what became of their son, Astrolabe? And here in M.T. Clancy's great biography of Abelard, A Medieval Life, published by Blackwell's in Oxford, England. Blackwell's is the largest, most excellent bookstore one could imagine. When I was teaching for years in Canada, we ordered all of our classics books and everything from Blackwell's. They had everything. And they would send you catalogs and new and used, and it was just a repository like the British Museum. Astrolabe, son of Heloise and Abelard, he was born in 1118. The Knights Templar was founded in 1119, after he had been given away. He was brought up by Abelard's sister at La Palais. Heloise asked Peter the Venerable to find him a prebend in 1144, that is, to find him a place where he could be. She was taking care for him, that he was now coming of age, and while Abelard had foregone the son, the the great head of a monastery, Saint Denis in Paris, helped Heloise take care of him. So a canon at Nantes Cathedral was called Astrolabe by 1150. In other words, he was honored. Yes, he was the son of Abelard, but he was in all practice the son of Heloise, who was making a way for him. Because by the time 1150, when she was 50 years old, she was formidable in the best of possible worlds. An astrolabe was abbot of Hauterive in Fribourg, 1162 to 1165. In Fribourg, because this is where, in southern Germany, the intellectual acumen was reaching new heights. And it is there in the way in which northern France, what became northern France, bleeds into southern Germany, and one begins to find not just the legacy of Hildegard of Bingen, but one begins to find the origins by 1165. Hildegard, or Heloise rather, passed away in 1164. And all the time she was tutoring one of the greatest writers in world literature. Not just providing for her son, who then became a very powerful figure, well taken care of. The necrology of the Paraclete names him as Peter Astrolabe, son of our master Peter. Abelard says in his history of his calamities that Heloise named him Astrolabe. A Latin poem of advice to Astrolabe is attributed to Abelard. But it is not just that Heloise is taking care of this enormous complex called the Paraclete, named for St. John's sending of the Holy Spirit by Jesus now in a shared presence, spiritual way, but as a competition directly to the Knights Templar, another order, the Knights of St. John, was formed about the same time to counter. And it's the Knights of St. John who understand that the Templars, in that original time period, have a hidden trigger of yearning for royal power and control, whereas the Knights of St. John were to be given, if there is a trigger for future developments, that it be noble, not royal. The difference is the emphasis on money or the emphasis on learning. The emphasis on property and control, the emphasis on service and help. And St. John, the hospitaliters, the one who run the hospitals, the healing of the ill, of the sick, of the outcasts, the wounded, goes back to the Therapeutai. Northwest out of Alexandria at the time of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The Therapeutai, the healers. So that one finds that the spirit of the Paraclete becomes a center that is tussling right at the earthquake of Troyes with not only Rashi and the founder of the Knights Templar, Hugh de Payens, but the great Chrétien de Troyes, the founder of Arthurian romances, and one of the greatest writers in the world, still, forever. Both the letters of Heloise and Abelard and Chrétien de Troyes are in Penguin Classics, still in print. They form a parenthesis of showing that around 1165, when Chrétien de Troyes, his Arthurian romance volume, for the first time came out, 5 parts. And the quintessential part of Chrétien is about the quest for the Holy Grail. The Holy Spirit Grail. It's not just that the Grail is the cup of the Last Supper. That is a mythos. That cup of the Last Supper was in the feminine lineage of the mitochondrial heritage of the women of Jesus' family, beginning with his mother, going to the 4 sisters, only one of which had a daughter, and that daughter had but one daughter, and that daughter had but one daughter. So in the 5th generation, there was only one woman that still carried the Holy Family mitochondria, and her name was Branwen. And she died of a broken heart because of what was involving her in a reverse Cinderella story. She began as a princess and ended up as a scullery maid in Ireland because everything was turned against her by the plotting of 2 stepbrothers. One of them kind of milksop, Nascent was his name, and the other was the bad Nascent, who was demonic, who took Branwen's baby son by the feet and threw him into the fire to be burnt alive, and engineered the way in which she was turned into a scullery maid. And her older brother, Bran, made an invasion with warriors into Ireland to free her, which they did, killing many, many people. And many of his warriors were killed. And in Wales, there is a hill, the Hill of Bran, that has the mausoleum remains of the whole mitochondrial heritage of the Holy Family's DNA buried in homage to this. It made for a melancholy sadness that penetrated so deep, so deeply, and was associated with the Last Supper and the crucifixion, that Jesus resurrected himself from the crucifixion after 3 days. The mystical vision was that the feminine would be able to resurrect this wisdom aspect of mankind were the cup found in its new encasement, and that was thrown away in tremendous tumultuousness in the 300s, in the 4th century. It was buried to protect itself because it had the keys that would pull the plug on the royal power structure of empire of Christianity. And when it was found in 1910, and finally brought to the attention of some conscientious people who were wealthy dealers in rugs and antiques who had branch offices in Paris and also in New York, that real grail, not just the cup but it's a filigree setting, had been taken to Paris to be cleaned and to be brought back into wholeness. And with the outbreak of the First World War, for safety, it was taken to New York. For a little while, it became glaringly famous, and then it was criticized and sabotaged as being something not really of great importance, and was filed away, and is still filed away today. And the feminine wisdom, resurrection of the mitochondrial DNA of mankind, to be able to come back in a spiritually conscious bevy of dimensions to redo not only Jerusalem, but the entire species, not only the planet Earth, so-called, this world, but the whole star system, and all of that into the reverberations that will be there on the interstellar frontier. So that those empires from other star systems that never had that possibility of maturity are fearful as those who would like to hold on to the empire possibilities of power and property and money here and now. All of that is not only in jeopardy, but is doomed. It will not hold. That pivot has a wobble built into it through falsity. And it's about ready to topple. Because of the loss of a dynamic. Because as soon as the dynamic of time is understood not to be just the one cyclic time of nature, but civilized time as a tripartite, a triad, a trinity structure to it. And that civilization has this triple time signature. And one has to learn to see that the understanding of time was made very manifest 2,000 years ago. And that time has a metronome, and it goes in a sine wave cycle of energy. It goes to a dip, to a trough, back to the horizon and up to a crest, and then back to that horizon. And in that sine wave, that time period is 2,000 years, and each one of those arcs is a 500-year period of going down to the trough, a 500-year period of coming back to the horizon, a 500 period of getting to the crest, and a 500-year period of coming back to the horizon again. Those 4 phases are a beginning of a carrier wave, the trough leading to the, not the negation of it, but to the via negativa of it, and coming back, and when it comes back to that horizon, is a millennium, is a 2 500-year cycles of the phoenix, they used to be called 2,000 years ago. Everyone called it that. From Tacitus, the great Roman historian, to all of the writers in Alexandria, it's the cycle of the phoenix, 500 years. And when they pair, that's a millennium. And when the millenniums pair, that's an aeon. A-E-O-N. And that aeon is the time period of a carrier wave. But that millennium, that 1,000-year period, the millennium, is not just that millennium, nor is it that just that aeon. There is a third kind of a wave, one complement as a prelude to the carrier wave is the reference wave, about 350 years before. But then there are pilot wave persons that are not independent so much, but that they are mobile infinitely because they are conscious. They have more dimensions than empires, more dimensions than royalty. They, in fact, are what Zarathustra 2 aeons ago called the nobles, the noble human beings, men and women. They are the ones who can then talk to and show and teach what Zarathustra calls the men of action, the men who can get things done. These noble friends can talk to them, but he or she who talks to them is the person of light. In the Iranian tradition that came in with Cyrus the Great, it's always called the man of light. But it's the person of light. It can be a female. In fact, very frequently it is a female. Who is the person of light who teaches the noble friends who then are able to teach the men of action, because the men of action cannot hear the person of light. Their very action in the universe obviates their ability to believe in, to have hope, faith, or charity in what is invisible to them, what is improbable to their computation, what just doesn't really, where are we going to make our money? How are we going to hold on to our property? People will not revere us, or fear us, or obey us. Well, everything will fall apart. Well, in the cosmos, everything is happily free. More next week.